to introduce Mitchell Frumpkin, who's president of KIPCon Engineering, and he's going to spend a few minutes talking to us today about reserve studies. Mitch, as a starting point, can you tell us a little bit about your expertise?
Sure, Chelsea, thank you. I've been involved in CAI and reserve studies for many years now. As a matter of fact, back in the mid to late 90s, when CAI developed the National Reserve Study Standards, I chaired the committee that developed those standards. Then after the standards were developed, we then came out with the National Reserve Study RS designation, or Reserve Specialist designation. In addition to that, I've been involved with a book that's published by CAI called Reserve Funds, and also the best practices paper that CAI does on reserve funds, which is right now in the process of being updated and should be released soon. In addition to that, just this past year, CAI updated the National Reserve Study Standards, and I co-chaired that committee with Bob Browning out of California, and just recently the new National Reserve Study Standards were released. So I've been involved in reserve studies for a number of years now.
Thank you. It is my understanding that a reserve study is broken into two parts. Can you spend a few minutes explaining to us what they are and a few of the critical things that you feel people should understand about the reserve study?
Sure, absolutely. The reserve study is broken into two parts. The first is the physical analysis and the other is the financial analysis. I'm going to use these charts to show you what they are and to explain to you a little bit about them. Now, this chart that we're looking at over here is a sample of a physical analysis, and it's broken down into a number of parts, but this is the basis for the entire reserve study. Because in this part of the study, the physical analysis, what we're doing is we're picking right here, and there's a column that lists all the components that make up the reserve study. So in this example, we have pavement, pavement overlay, concrete sidewalks, patios, bike paths, fencing, all those type of things. But just think, if you would set this up and the entire study was based on it and you had the wrong components, even though the entire study is right, it's still wrong because the components are wrong. So this is probably the most critical part of the entire study. And where you get those common element components from is generally the governing documents for the community, which describes what the common elements are and the limited common elements. But this column right here is the key to a good reserve study. The other things that we get into also in the physical analysis is we have the quantity of each component here, that's this column. How much of that component is there? For example, concrete sidewalks. There's 14,400 square feet. Then we have the cost to replace it. So for the concrete sidewalks, it's $10 a square foot. The thing that's very important to remember when you talk about the unit costs is that it has to include not only the price of putting the sidewalk in, but also the price of removing the sidewalk that is there. So a lot of times people look at an original reserve study done by a developer, for example, and this number may be low because it's the cost for the developer putting in the sidewalk and doesn't take into account that the association in later years is actually going to have to remove what's there also. The next column is just math. It's what is the cost to replace it? It's the quantity times the unit cost. So in this case, it's 14,400 square feet times $10 a square foot comes out to $144,000. So this is just the total replacement cost. Next, another important column is the beginning balance. Your association should be starting with money in your fund. So in this case, if we go down to the bottom, this association has $66,819 is their beginning balance in their fund. What happens up above is that $66,000 is broken down in a proportional way to each of the different components. So for example, out of that $66,000, since we're talking about the sidewalks, $18,214 of that goes towards the sidewalks. So this is your beginning balance. Obviously, the higher the beginning balance, the better, because that means you have more money. Next is estimated useful life. In this case of the sidewalks, we say, based on standards in the industry, that the sidewalk should last 30 years. So the estimated useful life is 30 years. That number comes from standards as well as experience in looking at sidewalks, because I sit there and watch sidewalks for many, many years. Then it's the estimated remaining useful life. So for example, our sidewalks have a life of 30 years. There's 19 years left. So that means the sidewalks are probably about 11 years old. 30 minus 11 equals 19. But also, we go out in the fields and we take a look at each of the different components to see what condition they're in. So if the condition is good, we may pick the estimated remaining useful life as more than how old it is, but if it's bad, it might be less. So this estimated remaining useful life is actually based on a field inspection to look at the condition. Then we have the annual reserve funding required. That's how much the association should be setting aside for each component. And it's a very simple mathematical equation. You take the total replacement cost, $144,000, subtract from that your beginning balance of $18,000. There's 19 years left, so you take 144 minus 18 divided by 19, and for this one component, you should be setting aside $6,620 a year. And it's very simple mathematical equation. You do that for all the different components. Then at the bottom, it comes out and it says what the recommendation for you should be setting aside should be. And in this case, by adding them all up, it comes to $27,518. Keep in mind, which I'll talk about in a minute, that this is based on the full funding model. So full funding, which I'll get into in the financial analysis in a second, is the funding model is very, very important, and you'll see why in a minute. Now, the last column is just telling you, if you were to set aside based on the full funding model, that amount each year, how much should you have set aside at this point? So in this case, we should have set aside $193,000. Of course, you're going to say, but we've only set aside $66,000. And what that means is this association is 66 divided by 199, about a third. So let's say about 30% funded, plus or minus. So while this number, the $193,000, is very important, the $66,000 shows you the current status of the fund, but don't be afraid, because just because your amount that you've set aside currently is less than the full funding amount, it does not mean that you're underfunded. It's just telling you the percentage. So this is what's known as the physical analysis. The next part of the study is on my other side. And what this is showing is the funding plans that you establish for the association. Now you look at this, and what this is showing, on the left-hand side, this is dollars, and on the bottom, it's time. So in this case, you start with $0 at the bottom, and you go up to $1.2 million. You start in the year 2017, and this generally goes out 30 years for your cash flow projected, in this case, to the year 2047. Now, I'm going to explain to you why full funding in many cases is overfunding by showing you what it actually is. Now, you take this top line. This top line is what is known as full funding. What you're doing is what we did in the financial analysis. We're adding everything together. We're starting at how much money they have at the beginning balance, and we're saying, okay, we're accumulating money. Whenever the line drops down, there's a replacement, and this projection to the future for 30 years. So every place the line drops, you're spending money. This is the full funding model, because you're putting enough aside, 100% for each different component. But what happens is, since there's many different components, replacements at different times, if you look in the future, you'll see that there is a significant amount of money that's sitting in your fund for a long period of time. In this case, if this is the low point over the 30 years, once you build up your account a little, then you're setting aside about $500,000 sitting in that fund that in the next 30 years you're not going to use. So this is the full funding model, the most conservative model. What are the other models? Let's go to the bottom now. If you go to the bottom, this is called baseline funding. Baseline. The reason it's called baseline funding is if you project it out into the future, and going back to this chart a second, it recommended setting aside $27,000 a year. $27,000 a year. So the top line is $27,000, but what we do is we reduce the annual amount that you set aside to a point where at some place in the future it drops down to zero. This is called baseline funding. It's reducing your annual contributions to a point that in the future drops down to zero. So of course your annual contributions are going to be left, but based on the concept of adequate funding, where you'll always have enough to replace everything, you'll always have enough, even though this drops down to zero at some time in the future. So this bottom is called baseline funding. That is the most risky funding plan to use, because, as you would imagine, if when it comes time to replace this component, it drops below, it costs $10 more, you're going to go into a deficit, or if it's replaced a year earlier, you're going to run into a deficit, so you won't have enough money. That's baseline funding. Now, what do most associations do? Most associations do what's in the middle. And you can't see this in yellow, so I'll go back to the green. But what most associations do is what's in the middle. This is called threshold funding. Threshold. What the association does is they say, okay, we don't want to be at full funding because we're overfunding. We don't want to be at baseline funding because it's too risky. We're going to establish a threshold at some point. And that threshold is a number that will never let the fund balance go below that number. That will establish our threshold. So instead of setting aside $27,000, you're setting aside less than that, but you're not setting aside so little that you're going to go to baseline. So that's called threshold funding. Now the question that always comes up is, for our association, how do we establish what this threshold should be? How low should we go? It's different for every association. You could have two communities right next to each other, exactly the same community, but different boards. The boards will make a different decision on what the threshold should be based on a number of different things. How much risk they want to take. For example, if they want to be very risky, they'll go to baseline funding all the way down here. If they want to be very conservative, they'll go all the way up here to full funding. So it's based on the board of the association, guidance they get from the management, guidance they get from the professional who prepares the reserve study, but the threshold is a very important item to decide and come to a number for your association. When we look at it, one of the things I do is I may go back to the component analysis, that's the financial analysis, and say, okay, if I look at the reserve cost to replace all the components, what's the most expensive thing on here? In this case, the most expensive thing is the sidewalks. So using that as an example, I may say, I never want my threshold to go below the cost of the most expensive component to replace, and I may set that at $144,000 or maybe $200,000 using my replacement costs as a guide. There's many other things to keep into mind. For example, you're never going to have to replace all the sidewalks at once. Some will last 5 years, some will last 50 years. But it's a discussion you should have with your reserve provider to come to a conclusion that makes you feel comfortable, that makes you feel like you're adequately funded, and it also takes into account how often you update your schedule, because if you update it every year, you may be willing to go closer to baseline, but if you update it every 15 years, which I don't recommend, then you want to be closer to full funding, because then you have a lot of money sitting there as a contingency in case something happens. Now, this is just a very brief overview of reserve studies and what are the critical components of it. So feel free to call us, to email me, ask any questions you might have. And again, also feel free to call and ask for a copy of the book on reserve funding, the GAP report. But I hope that gives you a basic understanding of what reserve studies are, what the two parts of reserve studies are, the financial analysis and the financial analysis over here and the fiscal analysis over here, and what the critical parts of those two parts of the studies are for you as a manager or board member to understand when you get your study. So thank you very much, and I look forward to meeting you in the future.